Thank you, Dr. Popot. So Chris asked me to share a bit the projects we're busy with at this point, and our projects, which will show I think the next step, going from this very first projects of experimenting towards a bit larger scale projects. So I have prepared 100 slides, which we'll go through in only 20 minutes. So we'll be
super
very fast one, but it gives you a bit of attention. Hey, first of all, I think we're all suffering from the same problem, a very toxic kind of cocktail, with on the one hand, of course, climate change, the other hand, the urbanization, and both they need space. And I think the role as an architect is the most beautiful one at this point in time, because there is so much happening. And I think you're not longer only an architect and urban planning, you're much more like a city doctor, and you have to try to solve the problems in your city. And we do that with water as a medicine, which is quite a positive message. We don't see water as a problem, we see it as a possibility to make cities better. Well, to understand the medicine a little bit better, and it was also one of the points that Chris made, why is it not happening all over the world? I think it has to do with law. That's the most important one. In the Netherlands, it took us, and then I mean all these groups of architects, maybe almost 15 years before it was allowed to have floating houses in the water. And what I don't mean just the simple boats which we have in Amsterdam, but really houses that are also by law a house. So that so the same building code, the same cost, the same insurance, the same legal framework. But once we had done that, then also other kind of structures could appear. Amphibious structures like this ones that seem to be a normal house, but that can be, if you walk around, you see it's also floating houses, which will emerge from the water once there is a lot of floods. Houses that are being built prefab, so in small CLT, cross-laminated elements, we brought to the site, still look like normal houses, but they move up and down with the water. If you want to scale up, it's not about one house or two houses, it's really about understanding the logistics of these kind of construction. For a project in Amsterdam, which is called Skoonskip, we had to rethink the construction process. And what is done over there was almost 50 kilometers outside the city. There was built a kind of temporary dry dock, temporary site where all the concrete foundations were being placed. All the houses were built on top of it and then craned into the water. And here you can see the concrete foundation underneath it, placed in the water and then towed to the location. And in the location, they were all connected, and it ended up in a kind of neighborhood with all experimental housing, disconnected from the grid. They made their own energy at the sewage system. They share energy. If one house has more energy than another house, you can take it from each other. So it's the next step. Housing in the Netherlands starts, of course, in canals and small lakes, but has already evolved into living on rivers. One of the projects is in Dordrecht. We just saw an example of that. And in that river there, you can see the water can even go in extreme situations, almost 4 meters up and down. For that, there is a big stills next to it. And even if you go on holiday, you come back, you will find your house still safe, only maybe a little bit higher than before. Some floating breakwaters around it. It's much more to get a little bit of the waves damped, but in reality, it's more to get the waste not into your neighborhood, because the houses themselves are stable enough to work with these kind of wave climates in that river. If you can do these kind of structures on the river, you also can go even to larger platforms built for modules, and we can go to what we call then floating islands. We are working now on floating islands in Bahrain. We're doing that with parties in Turkey who build modular structures. Modular structures are connected to each other. So you bring them as Lego parts, you make your complete shape. Then you take another layer of reinforced steel, and then you pour the concrete on top of it, and you can make almost every shape you want. And once you have done that, then you can place again the houses and the trees on top of it. So we're going to build 20 of these islands in Bahrain, and the first test island was just finished. If you can do islands, you can even go one step further, and that's designing building blocks. And a building block is then a platform with several floating houses on top of it, even parking in it. And if you place these kind of building blocks next to the shore, you can create complete neighborhoods that are not that different than neighborhoods you can expect in Amsterdam. And so in the wintertime, fantastic, of course, to skate over the water. So all these things are elements, are kind of medicine parts, which we can start to use for cities all over the world to solve their problems. The problem is not only housing, but it's also how we can get a better symbiotic relationship with nature. If we do designing on water, mostly they ask us to also take care of the green. For this, we have designed some floating parks that have green above the water and even green underneath the water. This is a floating park a small floating park in the south of the Netherlands, which is existing of all these modules, which are there now for almost a year and a half. And already we see a lot of changes underneath the water for the habitats of the fish. Very, very nice. And with the same structure, we also can grow now to the larger parks. We got a first assignment from the eldermen from Amsterdam, where they want to have a kind of modular floating park. And the idea was not to take only water away, but also keep the water, make it possible for people still to go there with boats and add a layer of green on top of it. So it will end up in a kind of park with almost 50 bridges, and you can go with the boat underneath it and still have the green on top of it. The beauty about floating parks is that they don't have to be static. So we think that one of the medicines and one of the solutions for cities that are changing and you want to adapt is that you also can adapt to seasons. So this is a seasonal park. It's for Toronto, where the park in the summer creates a fantastic open space in the middle where you can go with your boat and you can enjoy the water. But in the wintertime, the whole floating park is reconfigured, and it starts to be a system where we have on two sides a protected water, and where we do the green takes the wind of that region that place away. From that project, we even went one step further. We got a request for a project in Qatar, where the Emir of Qatar was thinking of how he could cool down the temperature in Qatar, in Doha. And for that, he wants to build a floating forest in front of the coast of 10 kilometers by 2 kilometers, really, really large. And by taking more shade on the water, they think they can reduce the temperature of the water with 1 or 2 degrees. And then with some cool wind over it, it must have a little bit of effect in Doha itself. Of course, you can't build a complete park from 2 by 10 kilometers. So it should be a kind of grid system where the technology came from the fishing industry, where you have these large fishing farms, also these round ship fishing farms of tubes, and in between we get then the floating mangroves. That brings us to the next medicine, and that is the adaptability and the possibility to react to changes and to request in your cities. We call them city apps, which are kind of instant solutions to upgrade the performance of your city. And to do that, you need structures that can be moved very fast from one location to another location, or can be moved. It doesn't have to be fast. Can be moved from one location to another location, and can bring a function and that connect that function to your city. This is a project we done in Miami, which is a large-scale floating villa, and the villa is it's both a floating villa, as a still villa, as a boat, so it can get all this kind of different kind of legal statuses depending what you want. Now here is a floating platform, but if you start to move it, it starts to be a boat because there's an engine in it. We have the electricity, we make it with the solar roof, and then if there is a big storm situation, we can push up the building out of the water And by that, the waves don't hit the building anymore, but only the stilts, and you get a lot of stability. Of course, this is fun for one family, but it's not about that one family, it's about the technology that's behind it. But with that technology, it's also possible to go up higher to 3, 4, 5 stories of very simple student housing, also with the same SoA+D system around it, so we can stabilize it a little bit. And by that, you have an instant solution if there's a request in the city for housing or student housing or for whatever function you need. So by doing that, you also can grow to these kind of floating offices. So it's the same technology as in that floating house, only now on the large scale. And again, scale is what we need. Another city app, a function that is brought to a city for a certain amount of time, is the floating theater. We are actually now building in Lyon, in France. And there the city has given the owner of the theater permission to get the theater there for 10 years. But after 10 years, it has to be moved. So they already have now made a deal with several cities in that region, that after 10 years, they get a new location on another city. So it starts to be a function that can be connected from city to city app. Made from very large concrete foundation. I think the largest been built in Europe till now in one piece. And inside we built it with CLT, and here you see part of the big theater stand there. And it will be finished, I think, at the end of October. So all these kind of elements can bring us slowly to a next step where we can use it to not only do functions, but really build cities of the parts of cities, because we think that expansion of cities will be beyond the waterfront. In the Netherlands, there's a difference between the architects and the engineers. We have Marin, it's an institute in Wageningen, who does all these kind of studies for large-scale platforms. And there was a study, it's called Space at Sea, for which Dutch engineers and architects worked together to see how you could build on open sea. Because you have maybe probably seen this fantastic, beautiful images of floating resorts on the middle of the ocean. Well, in reality, it's completely different, and sea is very difficult and very harsh, and you have to be very, very careful to start living on the water. So with Marin and with the engineers, there's been a study for large-scale floating platforms that are semi-rigid, so that the platforms can move a little bit, but together they create platforms that are stable enough to house more than 1,000 people. The architecture of these kind of cities on the water will be extreme. So instead of this having beautiful houses, we build kind of very large-scale steel fortresses, and then in between the fortresses we have these canals. But if you look then inside the courtyards, it can look now quite friendly, because you take the wind and the waves away. But in between is not a place for people to enjoy the canals like in Amsterdam. But it's the reality. It's on open sea. The sea is not your friend, and you have to be very, very careful to take advantage of the sea. So for us, one of the first projects we have built on water is what we call the SoA+D. There was most probably you have heard about it. There was a floating spar that was built just outside of Phuket in international waters. It was a floating spar, so it's like a big stilt and like a dobber if you go fishing. And so it can move up and down. It's completely not connected to the sea bottom. And there were 2 people who started to live in there, and they said, well, it's international water, so no, we think we are allowed to live here. The Thai Navy thought a little bit different, so they were forced to go away, and they have left the building, and they went to Panama. And they came to us at Waterstudo and asked us if we could redesign the structure, because it looked so unfriendly. So we designed what we call the SoA+D. And the CPOT is the second version of the structure that was built in Thailand. And it's a double-story building with only, I think it's 80 square meters inside, but we also have space underneath the water with an underwater room. And it's now under construction. It will be opened in the 21st of September, so in 2.5 weeks. And it's in Panama. And what we did, we made the shape now a little bit more friendly, a little bit more futuristic, because again, when you asked your question, why don't projects being scaled up? It's not only about technology, it's not only about rules and regulations, it's also about getting the people to love these kind of buildings and to understand how they could work in their environment. Here we can see the structure being built with the molds in Panama. Here's some inside views of that similar building. Here we made a foundation which could be used for more shallow waters. So if you have waters up to 40-50 meters, we can have the complete spar. But if we have waters up to 10-12 meters, we go for this kind of tripod of a floating structure underneath it. And here you can see it in the harbor in Panama, just before the superstructure. So the seaport itself is being placed on top of it. Here we're testing the stability of it. And here you see the first structure being put just on top of that foundation. So in a few months' time, they want to do, I think, 50 of these kind of seapods a year. And so this is the first scale up. And what the guys of the Ocean Builders, who is the client, did well, is they already thought about the whole engineering process. So not only about the architecture of the first of it, but how can you build them economically friendly? How can you make sure that it's within the rules and regulations? How can we sell them? How can we maintain them? So all these things are being added. And of course, if you build these kind of floating structures on open water, it's not only about the house itself, but also how you can go from one to another. And as these guys are from the Bitcoin industry and they have money enough, they can also test these fantastic kind of other kind of movements. So for them, in that same system, we've designed what they call Jetsonville. So in Panama, there will be a first neighborhood with around 220 of these kind of seapods with some floating harbors in it. And you see it's all connected and built around existing islands in the south of Panama. And what we try to do there is to rethink how a floating city or floating neighborhood could work. So all these kind of elements can move by themselves, or they can be moved and towed. And it can be a city that looks different in the next few decades. It can grow, it can shrink, and it can reconfigure. Here you can see some of the elements connected to each other. Also, there's of course a lot of floating green, which is important. And this will be the first part of the neighborhood, which they want to have ready in, I think, July next year. So then you have the first 6 to 8 seapods ready. With these kind of structures, we go to the next project. And of course, that's one of our most important projects is in the Maldives. The Maldives is for us a fantastic place where for the first time after almost 15 years that we work on these kind of floating structures, we really could do a large-scale project. Maldives is a country that exists of 1,100 small islands spread out over 700 kilometers under the south underneath of Sri Lanka. And almost half of the people are living in the main capital, which is Malé, which is one of the densest populated places in the world, which is 2 by 1 kilometers. And as you can see, it's just on the built in a lagoon, so that's in a quite shallow area. And outside there's very deep water, so there's also no possibility for the island to grow. Overcrowding is a problem where maybe 50 years ago people were still walking there on bare feet on beautiful sandy roads and only bikes were there. Today life is really difficult over there. You're living with 2-3 generations in very small apartment buildings. So there is a lot of social now problems they are facing. And what the government has seen that the only way to solve this is to add housing to the community. But where do you find space? Well, they have an island close to Male. It's called Hula Male. There's also the airport island, where they started to make some reclamation. This was just the first days after 2004 tsunami, where you already see that a lot of sand, because of the waves, been all washed away into the in the ocean. And there's again also the problem with these kind of reclamation projects that yes, you can make land, but if we get another 1 or 2 or 3 meters of water and we get other heavy weather conditions, then these islands are as vulnerable as the existing islands. That same island you just saw, they needed housing, so you need space, you need density. So what they did, they built these kind of towers, and each of the towers exists of, I think, 400 apartments. Each apartment is around 50 square meters, and it will cost you $130,000. And people, it was sold out within, I think, 2 months. So, and then they start to build, and the Chinese have built it for the Maldivians at the location. But what you get is people, it is not their kind of culture, they're not the way how they used to live on the islands. So together with the government, they said there has to be a joint venture, there has to be a new way to see if we can also take advantage of these kind of lagoons, as you see them here, these light blue rings, which are still empty, and without disturbing the environment. So this location here, you can see in the middle, that's the place for the floating city. You have the arrows towards Male, which is the capital city, on the, now here, right underneath here, this one. This is the airport island, and this is where all the garbage goes, garbage island. And then here it will be the floating city. The floating city location is, again, same size as Male, 2 by 1 kilometers. So it's quite large, and it has some natural reefs around it. So it's protected a bit by the waves. There's less wave activities as in the water around it. The bathymetry shows that the edges is up to 3-4 meters. So we can add a little bit of sand there, creating even more protection. And then for the inside, we had to find a way how we could place there more than 5,000 houses in a way that there is a right density between, of a balance between open water and these built structures. And we came up with an idea that comes from nature. This is brain coral, and what I like about brain coral, if you see well, is that the brain coral finds a fantastic balance between open space and the coral itself. So to allow the fresh water to penetrate and grow through the coral. So we took that as an inspiration. And we started to design the floating city with almost 17 kilometers of floating roads on which the floating houses are connected to. And we create a complete city with, which is of course then boat driven. And there will be all the logistics, and the people will be moving over the water towards the capital city where they will work, most of them. And inside it will leave us with sandy roads. That's very important, because this picture you see over here is how people live in the more remote kind of islands in the Maldives. Again, the sandy roads, a lot of space, a lot of green, and totally not the life that you can expect in the capital city. So this was one of the base elements we had. And second, we also wanted to have a kind of what do you say? Kind of hint towards the architecture of the locals, also from 50 to 100 years ago. For me as an architect, it's quite difficult because now we are contemporary architects. You always want to make crazy buildings, but here it was not about the architecture. It was really about how can you do a feasible building, financially feasible, technical feasible? How can we build it within 5 years? And 5,000 houses in 5 years is quite difficult. It's a lot. So all these kind of elements, they came to one a project, and we try to bring this kind of architecture there that is very, very specific for the Maldivians. So these are all prefab housing. It's only, I think, 5 types of houses we have, 2 and 1 story, and with a little bit of color and changes of terraces and balconies, we can create a structure of 17 kilometers of descending roads with the trees on top of it, and these different houses and places in between where the children can play. But if you then would zoom out, you will see that around that there is the water. So I think 50% of that whole area is open water, where you can also go with a boat and be connected to move back to the capital city. For the density on some places of the structures, we also go to 4 stories because all the platforms are connected to each other. There is an enormous rigidity and stability. And these structures you see here, they have the exact same apartment buildings, apartment floor plans as you saw in the larger towers in Hule Male. So we're showing that for the same amount of money you pay in the airport island, in the ugly towers from the Chinese, that you also can do this on these structures here on open water in the colorful place of Maldive City. Here you see the master plan a little bit more in detail. So as you see, there are almost 17 neighborhoods which are all connected with bridges. And if you zoom in, you see that it's built up of a center pile. Around the pile is a kind of triangle floating platform with sewage storage and utilities in it. And as a kind of veins, blood veins, that's all spread out over the roads, the floating roads. So if you would take away the sand, you will open a kind of cellar, and in the cellar you will see all the connections of the tubes. So it's a very simple way and efficient way of building a city. Then on top of that, of course, then the floating houses. Because space is scarce in these kind of locations, it's the roof terraces that are the most important, which give the people the fun and the open air and the looks and feel. And if you take that as a kind of building block, then all the building blocks together create this city. In the first year, they want to build 800 of these houses, then the year after 1,000, then 1,200, and then going up. I think 1,600 will end up in a 4.5 year time period where they built 5,004 floating units and plots. The first platform is now finished. That's a test platform with 4 houses on top of it. You see here also the roof terraces with the solar panels. It's been moved to location in the Maldives now in the next, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. And what it shows is that this simple architecture now can beautiful work. You see a very small part of the road with a few of the palm trees in it. We went to pick out the palm trees by himself. I love the ones that are a little bit out of, not straight. It gives a bit of a nice feeling. And so this will be the look and feel of the housing for the Maldivians in the next 3-4 years. Here you see the master plan in the top. There is the surrounding islands. So what we did is on the existing coral, we placed some sand just within a kind of what we call cover dams. So it's a kind of a system where you can create a better wave climate for inside and not disturbing the coral. It's on the edge of that of these small islands, and then inside we have all the waterways and housing. This brings us to the next step. From what will you do and learn from the Maldives? Well, the Maldives is of course a typical kind of architecture, typical kind of location, and we think that the real challenge is for waterfront cities around the world, and definitely, of course, Bangkok is one of the areas where this kind of thing can happen. Of course, you can look inside the country, but if you now only look to the outside, we think that these kind of floating cities will not be extreme in architecture or extreme in pattern or fabric. They will just be extreme in how they will be built and how fast they can emerge. And we think that these kind of cities will start to take water and use water for expansion, and slowly would grow into these kind of neighborhoods where water is used as transportation, but still you have your normal roads and your normal houses. So it shouldn't be that people feel that different in living in a floating city or an amphibious city as they would live on a normal city. And in the end, it will end up in kind of large-scale developments where people live in a kind of symbiotic relationship with the water. And I see it as quite a normal step, not different than maybe 100 years ago, 150 years ago, where people took advantage of high-rise building by creating vertical cities. The elevator was, of course, a very important technology. Now we have a floating technology, and as we also get grip on our legal framework and on our logistics and how to build it fast and cheap, we can create this kind of futures with the technology. Thank you.